So I think a lot of these things go hand in hand. If we start to take this holistic view of what cities are for and prioritize well-being of people in place, then the physical design of these places and what gets prioritized in the way that they're planned starts to shift.
Are you interested in urban regeneration? What do you think about the role of citizens, governments, and the designers in urban futures? How can we play an active role in urban futures? Stay tuned for answers from Alison Whitten.
What is the future for cities? Do you want to learn more about them? Do you want to know how others think about them? Do you want to be part of the conversation? Then this is the right place.
Welcome to What is the Future for Cities podcast. Today, I will interview Alison Whitten, the director of the Systems Lab at Regen Melbourne. We will talk about her vision for the future of cities changing focus, village framing, the role of citizens, and many more. So let's start with a proper introduction. Alison Whitten is the director of the Systems Lab at Regen Melbourne, where she oversees action research initiatives to facilitate urban transformation. She's also on the board of the Castlemaine Institute, a regional research and learning hub. Alison has a background in urban planning, international development, and management consulting. Her planning experience has focused on the intersection of design with food systems, public health, housing, and disaster risk mitigation. Alison has worked professionally across the public, private, and non-profit sectors in Australia, the United States, China, and Sub-Saharan Africa. She holds a BS in Systems Engineering and a Master in Urban Planning. And with that, Alison, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for your time. I highly appreciate your appearance on the podcast.
I'd like to acknowledge that I'm calling in from Jajawarang country in central Victoria and pay respect to elders past, present, and emerging. In all the work that we do, we acknowledge the resilience of First people on this land and all that they have to teach us about our present and our future.
And let's jump right in. What does the future of cities mean to you?
In some ways, that raised the most questions for me, even how are we defining cities? So I grew up in a suburb outside of Cleveland, Ohio. And even though Cleveland isn't the biggest city, we used to talk about going downtown when I was a kid. And it was always this exciting experience just going to a place that had taller buildings and a lot more activity and things that we couldn't do just in our smaller neighborhood. And so I think there's always been this intrigue about cities for me in terms of the experience that you can have going into places like that. As I got older, going to New York and eventually getting the chance to travel to Europe, further enforced this idea of excitement around cities. And you think about a lot of movies and things that show the same thing. Someone who's grown up in the country gets to a city for the first time, and that kind of wow factor that comes from being in a big place like that. So when I think about cities, I do think about bigger cities and the sort of energy and excitement and vibrancy that comes with them. But I think a lot of what I would consider today also relates to smaller places. I live in a small town outside of Melbourne now. And again, I talk about going into the city relative to where I live in a small town. And so that relationship between bigger places and smaller places is also really important to me. So when I think about the future of cities, I think about what these places have been and what they have the potential to be. When I first started studying urban planning, we were just at this tipping point where there was data out saying that more than 50% of the world's population was now living in cities. And this seemed like this interesting threshold. On the one hand, a question of why does this matter? What changes because of this sort of statistical shift? But on the other hand, it was pretty significant in thinking about the role of cities, I think large and small, as these concentrated places where now most of the world's population does live. And so we need to understand how these places work. How are they working for people? What are their impact on the planet? And again, these become more acute as we become more urbanized as a society. And so I think this is really the question that sits in my mind is, what is the identity of cities? How can they retain that vibrancy, that excitement, the things that drew me to cities, to being trained as a planner, while maintaining a positive impact for people and the environment as well?
I would love to understand how this statistic came into your studies, because I haven't met in my architecture education with this statistic, and we learned urban planning and we learned urban design. However, it was just a small segment of the architectural education itself. How did this 50% of global population living in cities manifest itself in your education? Was it officially in the education or it was your own interest?
It's a great question. I think I remember basically every course, my first semester of planning, starting with the instructor saying, and now we live in this urbanized world where more than 50% of the population lives in cities. And it might have been because my planning program was situated in an architecture and design school. And the planners were always arguing the case for why we were important among the disciplines. And so perhaps this is the way of saying cities matter in a holistic way beyond, and in addition to, but beyond the scope of individual buildings and beyond a pure design lens on cities. And so I do wonder if there was a little bit of that kind of case being made as part of presenting that statistic. But I think it was, again, seen as this pivotal framing for the importance and value of cities and what that meant for us to understand that and grapple with it as students who are starting out in the discipline.
This is amazing. And I'm so glad that you had this experience, that the statistic came out and then immediately went into the education, because that's, in my experience, not necessarily always the case, that these researches come out and then someone is saying that, yeah, at some point it will trickle down to the practice and then maybe into education. And now let's come back to the city itself, because you mentioned that you differentiate between bigger and smaller cities. And you also mentioned that the city itself is the vibrancy and the energy and the people living in them. Could you please explain a bit more about how do you differentiate between the sizes and what the city means to you with these size differences?
I think a good city of any scale is one that can operate as a collection of villages. And the smaller the city, the fewer the villages you have. So living in a smaller town, we have one cohesive center of town and activity center, and that defines the center of where a lot of things happen, where you encounter people, where you do your shopping and those kinds of things. Now, it's not to say that's the only way that a place can work, but I think, for example, part of why I was attracted to Melbourne when I first spent time here was because, or in Melbourne now that I live outside it, but when I was first attracted to Melbourne was because you felt that village feel in the center of the city, the way the laneways have been revitalized there. And you get that small, fine-grained sense of place and a human scale to it. I think a big city still requires that scale, still requires neighborhoods to be understood and valued and supported to thrive. And so when we lose sight of that importance of understanding nested scales, then I think we start to shift our understanding and conceptualization of the city. And that has huge implications for how cities are planned and designed. If we look at the way that infrastructure is built, how is it meant to operate? Is it connecting neighborhoods, or is it just seen as a big, crude kind of cut through a city? So I think this understanding of scale plays out in a lot of different ways that impacts on the experience that you can have in a place.
It's a very interesting thing that instead of starting from the big, you are starting from the small. And as the towns connect to each other, those create the city. Again, I would love to understand a bit more about these towns. Do they have a specific size or a limit where you say that until then it's a good size and then, in your opinion, should divide into two towns?
I don't necessarily. I think there's probably research that exists on this. I know there's research out there about how many people's names you can roughly remember and what that means for social circles. And you could imagine the equivalent existing around what's a scale at which a place starts to need to split into two, for example. But I wouldn't want to get bogged down in details or statistics or data on that, because I think there's probably a bit of a feel to that in different places, and it might look different. The CBD in Melbourne operates in a cohesive way, even though it's a very different urban fabric from one of the middle ring suburbs, which still has its own identity and operates in a cohesive way, but at a very different scale. So I think there's a fluidity to this, but I think it's acknowledging the way that different parts of the city fit together as opposed to thinking about an entire metropolitan region as one identical and singular place. And I start from this position of how we experience cities. And I much prefer exploring and living in urban places when I'm doing so on foot or on my bike or on public transport. And so I think in that sense, the experience of the city is around how you move around about within one of those village type areas and how you move from one to the next. And so I think that also, again, impacts the way that I understand and experience cities and think about the opportunities that they present.
Coming from Europe, where this kind of multi-central city thinking is, from my home, is missing, to be honest. So in Hungary, that's not necessarily the case. So I would love to understand, how did you arrive to this kind of thinking? Was it because you were living outside of Cleveland, Ohio, and then you went into the big city and then you experienced it throughout your youth? Or when you traveled to the bigger cities and you experienced that, oh, these smaller towns are connecting and creating the big city? Or was it during your education? How did you come to this kind of understanding of cities are built up of small towns, and when they have the connection well, then they create a good city experience?
I think it was actually when I first visited Europe. So it's interesting that your reflection is that you don't feel like Europe is necessarily reflective of this. But when I first went to London and to Paris, first two cities I visited in Europe, it felt like an entirely different experience to me. Of course, these are both big metropolitan areas, but we were able to explore through public transport, and it felt like many of the neighborhoods, at least the older ones, included this fine-grained, walkable feel. And I think a lot of that was because these places were designed before cars. So they were oriented towards movement patterns that weren't reliant on cars. Whereas even Cleveland, in the way that I've experienced it as a resident at various points, has been driven by a lot of car-centric infrastructure. And so moving through the city is quite different. So I suppose my particular experience was based on that shift from being in a car often to one where we were on foot and on public transport and able to move around in a way that felt more consistent with what I thought a good city could be. And again, there are cultural differences that were part of that experience as well. But I think there was quite a bit in that experience of being able to move around on foot, experience human scale kind of development at a fine grain that felt really exciting.
That's why I switched in my thinking, because London and Paris, yes, I also experienced the smaller aspect. In Hungary, especially, for example, Budapest, the capital, has different districts, but not necessarily towns in a sense that you could say that, oh, I left this town and I arrived to another one. But arriving on foot and the public transport is, for example, much better than in Melbourne, because it's not just radial rail lines and then in between some buses or trams. It's more connected to the whole thinking of the city itself.
Yeah, that was as a tourist. So, of course, I would imagine residents of some of these cities would contest some of these assertions, especially if you do live on the outskirts. A long commute is a long commute. So moving around a city becomes challenging regardless of the mode of transport if you need to move long distances to meet your day-to-day needs. But I think that's where opportunities for the future of cities to focus on how you can do more at a localized level, I think offer some real possibilities.
In your description, it comes out clear that the mobility and the transport is very important in your opinion. And I have the very judgmental opinion that in the last 150 years or 100 years, us designers have been a bit careless with our designs in cities, because unconsciously we have been designing around the car as the transportation mode. And it's really interesting to hear that you are talking about transport, but it's more about the public transport or the active transport or just walking around. How can we think about planning of cities while still keeping up this transport-focused aspect? Do we need to keep up this transport-focused aspect? Because I'm not sure whether that's a good direction, because then we again can be shifted towards the cars instead of public transport or active transport. How do we keep the good transportation front of mind and then create better, not nightmarish scenarios in cities?
This is, I think, a big minefield at the moment because it comes back to a huge shift in mindset and behavior across the board, because we are used to traveling by car. That's what's been embedded into cities, as you said. And I think it's really challenging when we start to shift that. And I would suggest that for a number of reasons, including environmental reasons, we do need to move away from car-centric transport. And I think if we take overall a human-centric approach to, again, what cities can be, the value of being out on the street in urban environments, those opportunities to encounter different people or see something that you wouldn't otherwise if you're driving past. There's so much value in moving out of cars for many reasons. And yet it's one of the biggest challenges that I think we have. I have thought about some of the projects in the US where freeways that have been central to cities have been dismantled, or in the case of Boston, have been moved underground to take roads that have split the city and remove them to stitch the urban fabric back together. And I'm sure there are critiques of these projects, but there's a reason why they've been done as well, because there's an acknowledgement that cars, even if we're turning them into EVs, still take up a big amount of space. And so if we go back to a set of principles around what our needs are as people in the city, what are the needs of nature in the city as well, then we start to come to design outcomes or approaches that would not center on the car so much. So I suppose that there's a lot of different ways to come to this assertion that I think car-centric planning loses sight of the potential that we have for space and giving more of that over to people in cities and probably to nature as well, making it a little friendlier for wildlife to be able to traverse throughout our urban environments.
And you just mentioned that this is a challenging situation. Thinking outside of cars, it's a minefield. What are the three biggest concerns or fears you have regarding the future of cities?
So when I arrived in Melbourne about 7.5 years ago now, started working in urban resilience here, there were three global trends that we were responding to in our work. And these weren't necessarily being stated as fears or challenges, but just trends that we needed to respond to. And I think they can become fears or challenges if we respond in ways that don't acknowledge the full potential consequences. So those three are urbanization, globalization, and climate change. Now, I think climate change is the obvious one that is, in my mind, is very obviously a challenge. We need to be both understanding how we reduce the impacts of climate change, how we mitigate against the impacts, but also acknowledge that we are in a changing environment and changing climate, and how do we respond to that and how do we adapt? So that's one thing that's pretty central to a lot of the work that I do and things that I think about on a daily basis. The other two I think are less straightforward, but really interesting just to unpack. I think we're at a moment in time where they are really evident. So I'll move backwards and we think about globalization. We felt a lot of that really recently with COVID and the way that obviously disease can spread globally. We're in the midst of multiple global conflicts that impact our supply chains. There are things that happen on the other side of the world impact us now in ways that they probably haven't in history, decades or generations ago. It doesn't mean that we become insular and isolationist, but I think it's about acknowledging what it means to be reliant on global systems and to think about how we need to be prepared to respond to when challenges arise at that scale. How are we prepared locally? How are our food systems set up to support us locally when we see the impacts of globalization on our local food supply, for example? And the other one is urbanization, which is the first that I named. And I think what we've seen here is an impact on nature. And also with it, I think this sense that we're separate from it. So the more that we become urbanized, going back to that statistic, I think one of the things that comes with it is this separation from the land. Fewer people are growing their own food. Fewer people are able to grow their own food. fewer people have a real connection with nature in a sense that allows them to understand the seasons or the ways in which climate might be changing around them, because in more urbanized environments, we have less contact with nature in a really deep and meaningful way. And so there are huge benefits to urbanization, and a lot of the growth that we've had as a society has come from that. But I think my fear is that creates and perpetuates a sense of separation, again, both from the environment, but also a sense of separation from each other, because more urban environments, as you start to move out of that village mentality and into larger spaces, you start to lose those connections to that smaller group of people that you may have known and relied on in past generations. And so I think there is some risk that we, again, start to see this separation, and that becomes a problematic dynamic that we need to work out in cities. It's not to say that we should be throwing the baby out with the bathwater in terms of the value of cities again, but it's about how we understand and acknowledge these things and respond to them so that we can have all the good parts and fewer of the challenging parts in our urban environments.
And that's a question. Do cities do this kind of urbanization well and globalization? Because if we are very pessimistic, then we can say that people are losing touch with each other, with nature. Everybody is getting more separate, more depressed because there is no human touch and nature touch. And we are, as you mentioned, more and more reliant on global supply chains. And if something on the other side of the world happens, then we are left without food, without water, without energy, and making our lives miserable. Do cities have value, in your opinion? Do cities do at least something well in this whole thinking? Because you mentioned that there are some good things. We shouldn't just throw out the baby with the whole bathwater. What do cities do well currently?
I feel like I'm not painting a very positive picture, which isn't my goal here. I think we just want to acknowledge and be really clear-eyed around those challenges, but again, not center them entirely in our understanding of cities. If I think about some of the strengths of cities, they are, again, these places of vitality and levels of activity that are really exciting and allow creative blossom. Just having exposure to different types of experiences is really important in that sense. Cities are places where you get to experience diversity of multiple forms, cultural diversity of thought, diversity of food. This isn't possible when you're living on your own in a rural environment without different communities around you. And I think also there's the economic reason why cities have existed in the way that they have for so long is this concentration of expertise and knowledge that we see in cities. And I think there are ways that we can use that really productively. And now's the time. I think we're at this pivotal point where we are starting to see that knowledge and expertise come together in really exciting ways that can help us, again, reimagine what that future of cities can be, what the vision is for these kinds of places.
I didn't mean that you were very negative, and we are getting to the opportunities, so that's on me as well. I was just curious what cities are doing well, and it's amazing that you jumped immediately to the strengths. I love that you were already painting the strengths question. And to be fair, when you described the fears, you were also throwing in that for climate change, we need to find the right response and the right adaptability, or finding the right balance with local things. So it's not that you are very negative because you're already giving us the questions which we would need to think through when we are talking about the fears and concerns, or just the challenges, if you don't even want to approach them as fears. So let's jump into the opportunities. What are the 3 biggest opportunities regarding the future of cities?
So I think we have huge opportunities, and a lot of these can be fun too. And I think that's part of the way we should think about all of our work, and especially, again, going back to the excitement that can live in urban environments. I think the first of these is about changing the goal of what cities are about. We can go back in time and think about how cities have formed over time, being able to protect ourselves in larger groups. We've seen this shift away from agrarian lifestyles into more industrial lifestyles and economies. And I think since that period, the economic reason for cities to exist has been incredibly strong and difficult to shift significantly. And it's interesting, again, when I go back to my planning education, urban planning as a discipline emerged because of the public health crisis that was occurring because of industry in the early 20th century, as meatworks and other types of industry were having really negative effects on workers and the forms of housing and the conditions for people to live in cities and work for those types of institutions were pretty poor. And so we're creating a system that was embedding inequality, embedding poor health, and not setting up the kind of city that we want to have. And obviously, we've made a huge amount of progress on many fronts since that time. And thank goodness that we have. But I do think that there are similar threads that we see now, taking different forms, but in the ways in which we embed inequality in cities and the way in which our economic goals don't sufficiently prioritize the well-being of people and the environment. And again, given the significant role of climate change at the moment, there's an imperative for our survival really to be focused more on the climate outcomes in cities as well as their impact beyond their footprints themselves. And likewise, we have, I would argue, a global moral obligation to prioritize the well-being of people as well. So I think it's really interesting to be looking at places like Bhutan and others that are really trying to start to prioritize well-being and embed that in the way that they set goals for their places. I had the chance a couple of months ago now to visit Bhutan, which was incredible to understand the way that they have embedded gross national happiness as something that sits alongside gross national product as a core metric and set of measures at a national scale. And this helps them to create policies that can serve people well while also encouraging economic activity, trying to look at all of these things in balance in a much more measured way rather than, again, setting up people to serve the economy. I think if we start to look at the economy to be in service of people and planet, then a lot of these things start to change. And I think a lot of a natural shift in how we understand and can get back to that purpose of cities as, again, places of excitement and joy and engagement. We can have that shift from purely looking at cities as places of productivity and wealth building and so on. But that's a significant mindset shift that I think it's a really valuable one to be exploring. The second opportunity that I see links back to some of what we talked about earlier around coming back to neighborhoods as a really critical unit and understanding the value of that sort of village framing within an urban context. Regardless of the size of the city, how do we understand people moving around in a localized way? How do we allow people to do so in a healthy way, meet daily needs close to where they live, see that as a liberating way to get out of your car and experience a place in a really holistic way? Again, because I live in a small place and really intentionally so, walked into town this morning and the sunshine was just glorious. And even though it was a winter day, it was amazing to feel the place that I was in really fully. And I really value being able to do that. And I think, again, at any scale, bringing city life back to that localized human scale potential is really important for social connection and also probably that connection to the health of the place itself. We care about things that we know better. And if we know our neighborhoods better and are able to spend time in them in really rich ways, then that allows us to bring that sense of care to them, which I think is really important and exciting. And I think the third piece, which relates a little bit to what I was just talking about now, is about finding ways for people to connect to nature more fully in cities. Again, how do we take the concrete out of the concrete jungle and start to bring in more green spaces, more biodiversity, more ways to grow food, just more ways, again, to be connecting to what often is fully separated from cities in that sense. So I think a lot of these things go hand in hand if we start to take this holistic view of what cities are for and prioritize well-being of people in place, then the physical design of these places and what gets prioritized in the way that they're planned starts to shift. I think there's a lot of potential and a lot of pockets of activity starting to show this. This has always been part of cities as well. It's not to say this has disappeared entirely, but It's about how do we do more this kind of work in the places where we live.
Can you give us some examples when you think that these opportunities come to shine?
In some of the work that we do at Regen Melbourne, we're really interested in what it looks like to regenerate at the street level. And I'll talk a little bit more later about Regen Melbourne overall. But just one example of a project that we're focused on right now is one called Regen Streets, which is really saying if we take broad principles of regeneration, which are about how do we leave things better than the way we found them effectively, how do we bring that down to a street scale? So it's the scale at which we can know the people around us because we see them regularly. And we can understand the local ecologies there, and we can understand what's possible to grow there and how the place works, basically. We've seen really amazing examples already across Melbourne where groups of neighbors, whether they're residents or businesses that are co-located, starting to say, how can we regenerate our street? And that's bringing greening into the place. It's bringing more opportunities for people to connect with each other. And having projects that are focused on bettering the physical environment, I think, is a really natural way to enhance social connection as well. So there are multiple benefits that can come from these kinds of ideas. And it doesn't take a lot in some cases for someone to say, I have an idea about what we can do to make our street better. And all of a sudden, you've got a wave of activity happening from among neighbors contributing to that and really changing the entire environment. And there's been a real history of that in Melbourne. We're very aware of that. And a lot of what we're aiming to do in Regen Streets is starting to really learn from a lot of that history, learn from the examples we're seeing now, look at how we can strengthen that and really form lasting structures around this type of activity. So our goal is to create a wave of regenerative streets so that we're seeing patterns of this activity all across the city. And that form of change can also influence the way that decision-making happens at a larger scale.
You just said decisions on a larger scale, but you were talking about a bottom-up approach. How the bottom-up, and I am giving words into your mouth, the top-down will meet in these opportunities.
This is, I think, the really interesting opportunity. We sometimes think we need to get the top down right first to make the bottom up possible. But actually, I think something that we've been learning through our work is that the bottom up helps to create the examples and the momentum that can make the case for change at a top down level. It's very similar to what Jane Jacobs was talking about back in the 60s in New York around community-led action that can shift significant policy and planning decisions at a larger scale. I think we're feeling some of that here as well. And we're feeling an appetite for that kind of activity to inform what's occurring at a larger scale as well. So it's a really interesting dynamic where the two almost rely on each other because that bottom-up activity is what demonstrates what people care about, frankly, what voters care about. And so that kind of voice is really important when it comes to the way that political decision-making might occur, as well as then the types of decisions that planners and government officials at different levels might consider. So at the same time, it is nice when some of those top-down policies do line up. We know that things like insurance policies at a local level or even the state level can sometimes impede some really basic local activities like having a street party, which is good on many levels, but often then seen as a risk from some vantage point. We're looking at ways that we can start to disentangle some of that challenge so that we can open up more opportunities for that bottom-up activity to occur and start to see more of a trusted relationship between the members of the community and the decision makers at a planning and policy level. So it does start to become quite complex, even though I suppose I've been talking about some of these opportunities as fairly simple. Just get out and plant your nature strip, but actually you might not be able to do that because the local laws prevent that. So how can we start to create spaces where really good examples of local activity can help to shift an understanding of what some of those barriers are and help to open up opportunities to change those.
Which brings me to the question, what do you think is the role for the citizens in the city?
I feel strongly that citizens need to play an active role in cities. A lot of the work that I've done in urban resilience and now with Regen Melbourne is really thinking about what the role of citizens is in decision-making and making change happen in cities. And it's an interesting tension to start to unpack because I think a lot of what we know through evidence and experience is that more active citizens can be more resilient. They're more prepared and able to respond when challenges and disasters occur. That can be seen probably in any sort of natural disaster situation, and would have been true in places in COVID where you have more active communities, you're more able to respond collectively. This is, again, going to be increasingly important as we see greater effects of climate change. Likewise, I think active citizens should be able to play a meaningful role in decision-making on things that impact their lives. If there is a significant change planned for a neighborhood, then of course the members of that community should have a voice in decision-making about it, and other things as well. So I think there's plenty of evidence and interest in that kind of active engagement, but it's not always straightforward in the way that it happens. We have this sort of spectrum from participation through to representation. And often when we are then talking about, yes, the importance and the role of active citizens, and we get pushback saying, why aren't our elected officials and our representatives on the other end of the spectrum actually taking care of those things for us? Why are we putting the responsibility back on citizens to do this work when it's potentially the work of government, for example? And so there is this tension, I think, that exists. And I think what it often leads to is friction, sometimes healthy and sometimes less so, between communities and various levels of government. And sometimes that's a healthy friction because there's a level of expertise that exists in all parties and certain knowledge that needs to be surfaced to make really informed decisions. But I think sometimes there's a sense that certain parts of our institutions have a certain role in decision-making, and that's quite set, and it doesn't always allow for active involvement from citizens. So I think there's an opportunity to be opening up decision-making, to be more inclusive, and to acknowledge various types of knowledge that exist within communities, and to trust that those represent different forms of expertise. And I think that's part of what we can do to make cities a better place, and a place that can be more inclusive and meet the needs of the people who live there, is to make sure those voices are heard and incorporated in the way that decisions are made.
I would also add, as a personal experience, that as designers, we haven't been doing a really good job in involving the citizens. So the citizens don't really understand that they have a power over their built environment. And that's partially on us, because we have been just presenting the designs that this is what you get, be happy with it. And they were like, yeah, fine. So there is no real feeling of empowerment and responsibility. And I think that's also on us designers to bring back that this is the design journey. Let's come together and enjoy the whole journey together. You will understand why the decisions have been made. You can change those decisions, and please let us know what's your problem in the city, because then we can help you solve those problems. What is the role of the government in cities?
First, I want to go back to your comment about the role of designers, because I think it's a really interesting one. And likewise, I think planners fit into that category, because these are professionals who have technical expertise that's really important in shaping cities. And again, when I was studying planning, I felt this tension where it was this sense of, I'm learning all of these new skills, and I know more than average Joe on the street in terms of how a city could or should work. And doesn't that mean that my knowledge should be privileged? But actually, as I moved through my planning studies and got the chance to do more community-based work, I really understood the role that we as planners and designers can play as facilitators. And it's actually quite powerful to be able to use those skills to bring community voices to bear and to give shape to what those voices are calling for. And so that's, I think, what is most exciting about planning and design professions, is the chance to use those skills in really constructive ways to help bring community visions to life. So it's a really nice way, going back to that sort of full participatory through to representative spectrum. Designers sit on that as well. I'd say the same is true for government. There are very clear roles that government plays, and I think there's value in those too. There's structure and clear processes for decision making, which I think is really important. What I also think is important is for government to create space for communities to be involved in decision making. Often, again, when we come back to planning related issues and some design related issues, communities given the chance to respond to a design that's largely finalized or often looks very final. And there's a real opportunity to go back to questions on what communities value and start at that point and allow the design work and the physical planning to flow from that. And often, because of budgets and timelines and so on, engagement processes are set up to be much more constrained and don't allow for that space. So I think when governments, again, come back to their role in safeguarding the welfare of people who live in cities, safeguarding the welfare of citizens and the environment as well. Again, if we go back to a goal of well-being, then the role of government is to set up structures that allow that well-being to occur and allow people to flourish. And again, if we think that active citizenship is part of that, which I certainly do, then creating space for people to be involved in governing themselves to some extent is part of that.
You have been talking about regeneration and resilience, and I would like to understand, what do you mean by these terms? Regeneration first.
To me, regeneration is about leaving places in better shape that we found them. So largely looking at our natural systems, there's a lot of benefit that our environment gives to us, but beyond that, it has inherent value, including just the beauty that it brings. I think regeneration starts with understanding and valuing the environment and how that translates to understanding and valuing human life in relation to that. When we can do that really well, we see places flourish and we see people in nature living really beautifully side by side. And we have a greater appreciation for, again, that relational aspect. We don't have that sort of separation that I was talking about earlier. And so I think regeneration needs to start with that idea of connecting back to nature, connecting back to each other as well, and understanding that relational aspect to all parts of life, and in an urban context, what that looks like in a city. And it might take different forms, but I think that those principles can hold in many types of environments.
And that's a very interesting part for me, because I would like to also know whether this regeneration of environments also includes the built environment. Because yes, we have been, let's put it this way, careless a bit with our natural environment, at least in cities, also outside, but let's focus on cities for now. But we also have been careless with our built environment. Do you think that regeneration can also include the built environment itself?
Absolutely. I think it can include the built environment. There's a lot of value in respecting the way that the built environment has evolved over time. Certainly, there are strong advocates for respecting the heritage of buildings and character of places. Now, I think that needs to be understood holistically, but I think that regeneration of the built environment is actually a pretty key ingredient in strengthening the well-being of cities over time. And I've been involved in a lot of discussions recently and a lot of activities related to retrofitting. And I think that's effectively what we're talking about when we think about regenerating the built environment, is saying, how can we take something that exists and that has had value and give new value to it? And it might mean that we're changing the form of what that is in terms of turning commercial buildings in the center of the city into housing, because that's what we need more now. Or it could be about how we regenerate the strength of a building so it can be a healthier and more resilient and more ecologically friendly place to live. So there are lots of different ways we can think about regenerating the built environment. Even, again, going back to that neighborhood scale, what does the neighborhood look like? What does the neighborhood need to feel safe and friendly and like a place that's amenable to people wanting to spend time there? At different scales, I think there's always opportunities to regenerate built environments. I think the important thing is doing so in an inclusive way so that we're not locking people out of different parts of the city as a result of those changes. But I think the more you involve people in that process, the more chance there is for that built environment to take a new form, but still allow people who have strong ties to that place to stay there and help it to thrive and really contribute to that regeneration of place.
Thank you very much for the clarification. The other term you have been using is resilience. What does resilience mean to you? And how does resilience connect to regeneration?
So resilience, I can give the technical definition that we used to use all the time and is still used in many places, which is really focused on this ability for systems, people, communities, economies, all parts of our built environment and natural environment to adapt, survive, and thrive no matter the type of chronic stress or acute shock they face. So it could be the slow burn, things that occur in a place over time, or it could be the really quick challenges we face. COVID went pretty quickly from being an acute shock to this sort of chronic stress that we're continuing to grapple with in our society. And I think that's a really good example. Climate is felt in really acute ways when we have bushfires and floods, but there's the slow burn of increasing heat over time, for example, that has an impact on what can grow in different parts of our country and so on. Resilience and regeneration, I think, go hand in the sense that regeneration is about understanding the potential and the value of a place based on its inherent characteristics and being able to respond to those things in ways that truly understand them and allow them to thrive, I think, no matter what the conditions, or more fully, regardless of the types of conditions that they might face. And that's very consistent with how we think about resilience. Now, of course, there are some differences to that, but I don't think we consider either of these to be linear. It's not like you can ever fully reach a regenerative state potentially. And likewise, you would never be entirely resilient. You can be more regenerative and more resilient. But these are things you can always strive to do more and more fully, which is both frustrating at times when you really want to have an end goal to the work you're doing, but also I think quite exciting when we look at the potential to continue to learn and improve the way that we understand our surrounds and respond to the things we need to around us.
I'm really glad that you brought up this urban evolution, because in my research, I have been struggling with smart cities because the smart city term also implies a final destination. And I really believe that cities are evolving with us. So a term which implies a final destination is a very bad term. So that's why, for example, I always talk about smarter cities. Do you think that we are talking about resilience and resilient cities or regenerative places? Because saying that more regenerative places would be way too long?
Possibly. And I think we live in a very goal-driven society where we want to be able to say that we've achieved something, which we can always do in different ways, but we can never be the most resilient city or the most regenerative city. I think there's a tendency to want to be able to state that we have a goal and we are able to meet it, and here are the things that we will do to get there. And that feels too clean in the kind of complex environment we're in and the breadth of challenges we're facing. And so I think acknowledging that we're on a journey and really thinking about what are the pathways that we want to be taking on that journey, that's really the question to be asking, more so than what's the destination and how do I get there as fast as possible. Certainly we want to have a goal to give us direction, but to understand that it's a long game that we're playing, I think is really part of the equation.
And then you have been talking about climate change and regeneration and resilience and nature and the natural environment, and you haven't mentioned sustainability. May I ask you, why is that?
So on the one hand, maybe the trends have evolved enough that we're past sustainability as the trend that's in vogue. When I was in my undergrad, sustainability was the core term we were looking at as engineering students and really thinking about this triple bottom line concept. That language seems outdated now, even if the concepts are still relevant to what we talk about. I think one thing that is clear to me is, again, this difference between sustainability and resilience, where sustainability really is tracking towards this linear sense of state that we want to maintain, whereas resilience acknowledges that we will have interruptions to our current state and we need to be able to respond to those. And ideally, we come back stronger from those disruptions and so on. But I think sustainability is still valuable to understand, but I think we're in a position currently because of the threats of climate change that we really need to be looking at past sustainability, because what we have currently isn't enough. We want to be moving beyond that understanding again in the kinds of interventions that we're looking at and the pathways that we're exploring towards what can come back and restore nature and regenerate places, more so than sustaining things that may not be working in our best interest or the best interest of the environment. There are some things to sustain, but probably not everything we have going.
I agree with that statement that sustaining might not be our ideal goal. Alison, you have been very generous with your time and answers, and I really appreciate that you have been entertaining my all-around, everywhere questions. What is your role establishing the future of cities?
It's a good question that I think has changed a bit over time. In a really privileged position right now to be working with Regen Melbourne, which gives us a really great platform for both thinking about the vision that we want for future cities, as well as exploring some of the pathways towards that kind of more regenerative and more resilient future that we want to see. So just a little background on Regen Melbourne is that we formed out of the Black Summer bushfires and the COVID-19 pandemic when Greater Melbourne was sitting in intense lockdown. That was a point where we realized our current systems are probably not entirely sustainable and we need to be looking at a new future vision for the city. And so we started to explore donut economics as a framework. I say we at the time, it was a collection of organizations coming together asking this question, thinking about how could we use the donut as a concept to think about a future vision for the city. And donut economics really looks at how we can create a strong social foundation. So that forms the inside of the donut. We want to be meeting everyone's social needs. And we want to do so within the bounds of the planet. So that forms the outside of the donut. We don't want to be overshooting on those planetary boundaries. So that safe and just space that we aspire for is the donut shape. So we want to be inside that donut. This was actually a pretty exciting opportunity to embark on. We ran a series of workshops with over 500 community members, 50 organizations in the end, that helped to explore what it could mean to use that donut as a vision for Greater Melbourne, and produced the Melbourne Donut, which we modified a bit. We added arts and culture because that's a part of Greater Melbourne's identity. We also added a piece that was acknowledging this idea of healing and reconnecting to country and each other, which goes back to some of what I was talking about in terms of that role of connection and kind of acknowledging the separation that's occurred over time, and also acknowledges the strong connection to country that comes through the knowledge of traditional owners here. And we really need to be grounding that knowledge in place and that deep connection that traditional owners have here, which is inherently regenerative and resilient. So out of that exploration, we realized that an entity needed to sit behind this work. There was momentum, there was energy, there was a need to do something about it. And so Regen Melbourne formed as an organization and began to explore what its role really needed to be, filling gaps in the city towards this vision for a regenerative future. And so now we serve as this platform for collaboration. We host a series of what we call wildly ambitious projects, which are our pathways towards that regenerative future. And so this is our way of grounding that vision and saying, what does this look like in practice? And again, each of those projects is not going to solve the whole equation. Even the combination of them is not going to move us into that safe and just space entirely for Melbourne. But what we do expect that they can do is demonstrate different ways of working and start to unlock some of those barriers that I mentioned earlier, start to get people collaborating in different ways, and use that as an example of the kind of work that we want to see multiplied across the city. Now, we know there's a ton of really interesting and valuable work happening as well. So a lot of our role is connecting with people who are doing a lot of this really challenging and exciting work already, and really looking at how we can knit that together and strengthen that and build greater momentum. So my role in this space is leading our systems lab, which is really looking at these underpinning questions around what are the roles of the likes of research and policy and capital and storytelling as these enabling functions that are necessary for our projects to work, but are also necessary for this broader journey of regeneration. And so we get to explore these questions and themes around different ideas and concepts and use our projects as a way to test some of that thinking. So it's a really new space, but it's super exciting. When I think back to the academic background I have, starting as a systems engineering student as an undergrad and then moving into urban planning, I can't imagine a role that could have brought those disciplines together in a more exciting and coherent way than what's been created through this role. This kind of position wouldn't have existed 20 years ago when I first started thinking about the kind of work I wanted to do. So as we talk about the evolution of cities, even the kinds of roles that become available change significantly over time, which is pretty cool.
And please keep up the good work, because what you are doing in Regen Melbourne is just amazing. I really want to swim in the Yarra, so I want to see that audacious and ambitious goal come to fruition. And that also shows how you are thinking in a holistic way, because that's not just one specific authority you need to talk with, but along the URL, coming together different communities and governmental agencies and whatever, they need to talk to each other and work together. So thank you so much for your role and work. Please keep up the good work. Do you have any closing comments or requests for the audience?
I think just a reflection on where you live, going back to this understanding of place and our local environments. I think we all have an opportunity to play a role there. You mentioned our work on the swimmable Birang. That's been really exciting because what it's enabled is just that little bit of extra opportunity to surface through bringing people together in different ways. That's enabling us again to think about how we shift our systems pretty significantly through what sometimes feels like slow change, but we're moving at that pace of trust and really learning from each other in a really dedicated way. And I think that's what it means for all of us to be making change in the places where we live. We recently had a really lovely conversation with Liz Weaver from the Castlemaine Institute in Canada, and she imparted some really great advice, which was when we go into these settings of collaboration where we're all saying, this is great, what do we do? And it all starts to feel really overwhelming. She said, we often ask, what's that extra 15% you could do? So it's not shifting what you're doing entirely as a starting point, but it's what's that little extra that you can give or could change in what you're doing. And I think that's been a really nice offering that we've been able to adopt. And that I would always call out to others is what's that little extra 15% that makes a difference for you in the place where you live and can make that a better place.
Thank you so much, Alison.
It was really interesting to hear from Alison about village framing for bringing back the local touch. Not to mention her description for the needed urban retrofitting. Ellen Pierce talked about similar things in episode 196. You can find out more about Alison online. All the links are in the show notes. What was the most interesting part for you? What questions did arise regarding Alison's approach to the future of cities? What have you learned from this interview? Let me know on Twitter at WTF4Cities or on the WTF4Cities.com website where the transcript and show notes are available. You can also subscribe on the website not to miss any new episodes and leave some feedback. I hope this was an interesting interview for you as well, and thanks for tuning in.
What is the Future for Cities podcast?